At the Fairweathers' exclusive Sunday lunch, the judgment began the moment he arrived. They saw his quiet nature, his dark skin, and thought they had him figured out. But the man they saw was not the man he was. The air in the grand dining room of the Fairweather estate was thick with expectation. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above the mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen. Crystal glasses sparkled, heavy silver gleamed, and a centerpiece of white roses, as perfect and seemingly untouched as everything else in the room, stood sentinel. This was the Fairweather Sunday lunch, a ritual as old and established as the family name itself. Today, however, carried an extra layer of scrutiny. Today was about Isaiah. He stood a few feet away in the adjoining drawing room as guests arrived, speaking softly to a distant relative. Isaiah was tall, lean, but solid with deep brown skin and kind, intelligent eyes. His tailored linen shirt and slacks fit perfectly. Not flashy, but intentional. He had a way of carrying himself that made people notice, even when he wasn't saying much. And maybe that was part of the problem because people were noticing. As more guests arrived and clustered under delicate ceilings with glasses of champagne, the whispers began to ripple like wind across still water. Quiet, but not quiet enough. Is he from around here? Does he come from money? I heard he's some kind of consultant, whatever that means. One of Clara's cousins, a wiry man in boat shoes and pastel shorts, murmured. He seems nice. Hope he doesn't Uber here today. A few nearby guests chuckled under their breath. From the corner of the room, an aunt sipped her drink and glanced over the rim of her glass. She could have had anyone, and she chose someone. So different, she said, drawing out the word like it had thorns. Isaiah, as if sensing the temperature of the air around him, simply smiled and nodded politely when approached. He complimented the house, praised the refreshments, and thanked everyone who welcomed him, even those whose eyes barely met his. Clara made her way to him, gently slipping her hand into his. You okay? She asked quietly. I'm good, he said, his voice low, even. How are you holding up? She squeezed his hand. Better now. But even as they stood together visibly in love, the subtle lines were being drawn. No one said anything directly. No one had to. It was in the glances, in the slight tilt of a smile, in the way no one asked Isaiah a follow-up question when he answered. At one point, as he bent down to help a staff member adjust some stacking dishes, Clara's uncle walked past and muttered to another, that one's handy. Must be used to set up work. Isaiah heard it. His shoulders stiffened for a half second, then relaxed. He straightened, wiped his hands calmly, and returned to his seat without a word. That was the thing about Isaiah. He didn't perform for people. He didn't puff up or shrink down. He simply was. And let that be enough. But to the Fairweathers, whose wealth was old and whose curiosity about anyone outside their country club circles was even older, his quiet composure was easy to mislabel. They assumed humility meant lack. They mistook calm for smallness. What they didn't see, what Clara did, was the fire behind his stillness. The kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself because it never had anything to prove. The kind of man who never had to name his worth out loud. Not yet, anyway. The lunch gathering continued under the warm afternoon sun. The Fairweather estate dining room glowing in all its curated perfection. White table linens draped neatly, and a playlist of instrumental jazz hummed in the background. Wait staff moved with practiced grace between guests, refilling glasses and passing around delicate appetizers. Clara stood near the large windows, watching as Isaiah spoke with a relative about local architecture. His voice was low, considerate. He gestured toward a serving tray, offering to help carry it. Always generous, always hands-on. She loved that about him. But the air was shifting. It started with the smallest of things. A comment, a smirk, a badly concealed eye roll. As Isaiah walked back toward her, Clara's Aunt Sylvia leaned over to one of the other women, her voice low, but not low enough. Loafers indoors? She said with a forced chuckle. Interesting choice. Clara turned her head sharply, lips parting. Isaiah didn't react. Didn't even flinch. He had heard it. He just kept walking, calm as ever, like someone used to choosing his battles. Then came the cousin Reese, blonde, cocky, and perennially underemployed, approached with a champagne flute and a smug grin. He clapped Isaiah on the back with mock familiarity. "Hope you didn't Uber all the way out here. Man," he joked. "Might cost more than the suit." A few people laughed, not loudly, but enough to sting. Isaiah chuckled softly. "No Uber today, just a rental." Reese raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised Isaiah even knew what to say. "Well, good on you," he replied as if handing out a medal. Clara stepped in, sliding her arm through Isaiah's. "He has a better sense of direction than you ever have, Reese," she said with a smile that barely masked her irritation. The conversation dissolved into polite small talk, but the undercurrent was clear. Isaiah didn't belong here, at least not in their eyes. Later, as the staff prepared the serving station for the main course, Isaiah noticed one of the silver platters had been placed slightly out of place. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and began adjusting it. Someone nearby saw him bending down. "Oh, that's sweet," said another aunt. "This one with pearls and a voice like dry paper. He's used to service work." The phrase landed like a slap in the air. Isaiah straightened slowly, looked toward the speaker, and smiled. "Just figured I'd help make things beautiful," he said. His tone was warm, measured, disarming. The woman blinked, caught off guard by his grace. She turned away, suddenly interested in her glass. Clara had seen enough. She walked over and took Isaiah's hand, holding it tightly. He gave her a brief look. No words, just a shared moment of knowing. She leaned in and whispered, "I'm sorry." He squeezed her hand. "You don't have to be." But she could see it in his eyes. The pressure of dignity, the quiet exhaustion of having to make others feel comfortable with his presence, with his skin, with his difference. Still, he remained Isaiah, kind, composed, unbothered on the outside. Even when the whispers followed him like shadows. At lunch, the long table was set under the shade of the dining room's large windows. Clara sat beside Isaiah, their fingers brushing under the tablecloth. Across from them, one of her uncles leaned forward and asked casually, "So, what do you do again, Isaiah? Something with websites, right?" Isaiah smiled. "I work in private consulting primarily in strategic investment and tech infrastructure." The uncle raised an eyebrow. "Sounds vague." Isaiah chuckled. "It can be." The others around the table shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to place him. He didn't fit their script. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He wasn't overly friendly either. He was just present, grounded, unapologetically himself. That more than anything made them uneasy. And Clara knew it. She saw it in every exchanged glance, every forced smile, every attempt to pin Isaiah into a stereotype that would make them feel more in control. But he gave them nothing to hold on to. He didn't flinch. He didn't explain. He didn't shrink. By the end of the meal, it became clear Isaiah didn't need their approval. He had never asked for it. The lunch table stretched beneath the soft afternoon light, gently illuminating the room. Laughter rose in spurts, forks clinked against china, and glasses of white wine glistened in the soft glow. It was picturesque, like something out of a lifestyle magazine. And yet under the surface, quiet currents still tugged between every smile and toast. Isaiah sat near the middle of the long table, framed by greenery and candlelight, his posture relaxed but alert. He had the kind of stillness that drew attention. Without asking for it, Clara sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee beneath the table. A small gesture of quiet solidarity. Across from them, an older uncle named Arthur leaned back in his seat. He was known for speaking plainly and a little too often, his voice naturally booming, even in moments that required restraint. "So, Isaiah," he said, swirling his wine, "tell me, what exactly is it that you do?" There was a brief hush at the table. A few heads turned subtly toward Isaiah. Forks paused midair. Isaiah didn't blink. "I do consulting work," he said, tone even mostly private partnerships. It was the same answer he always gave. Simple, Clean enough. Clara offered a small smile, but said nothing more. She had learned that Isaiah preferred to let people reveal their own assumptions. Arthur raised a thick brow. Consulting. He? That's easy broad. Another relative chimed in with a chuckle. Must be hard making a living just giving advice. A few soft laughs followed. Safe, shallow, not cruel, but not kind either. Isaiah smiled. Sometimes, he said calmly, but it pays the bills. His voice was light, almost amused, not defensive, not boastful, just grounded. The table moved on quickly, shifting to topics about local events and the estate's history. But Clara caught the way her mother's eyes lingered on Isaiah a little longer. Her father, seated 2 chairs down, had barely spoken the entire evening. He watched quietly as though studying Isaiah, not just as his daughter's fiancé, but as a man in Isaiah that he seemed completely unaffected. He didn't fill the silence with awkward attempts to impress. He didn't list his credentials or mention the partnerships he'd negotiated with Fortune 500s. He didn't bring up the company he'd built from scratch, Ascend Group Holdings, or the global philanthropic arm he funded privately to support tech education for underserved communities. He didn't need to because Isaiah knew something they didn't. Power didn't shout. It whispered. It showed up early and stayed late. It let other people underestimate you. It let the room laugh as long as you walked out owning the building. Clara watched him with a quiet pride that only deepened with each passive jab and each gracious reply. She'd seen him at conferences, in investor boardrooms, in front of foundations where executives leaned forward when he spoke. And here, among name-dropping relatives and outdated assumptions, she saw something even more valuable. His restraint. He didn't owe them proof. He owed himself peace. Later, as dessert arrived, tiny fruit tarts with gold-dusted berries. Someone brought up the idea of travel plans. Any big plans? A cousin asked with genuine curiosity. Clara smiled. We're thinking of taking a few weeks off in September somewhere quiet. Oh, another guest asked. You're able to take that kind of time off, Isaiah? He nodded. I set my own schedule. Makes things easier. Must be nice, Arthur muttered, not hiding the edge in his tone. Isaiah simply nodded again, unbothered. It is. The words floated out like a leaf on water. Soft, but deliberate. Not a challenge, not an apology. And somehow that was what silenced the table more than anything. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, casting a golden warmth across the Fairweather estate as the lunch neared its end. Glasses had been refilled, plates cleared, and laughter had gradually softened into a low, content murmur. The air was calmer now, tinged with coffee and lavender. Clara remained seated as the staff brought coffee, a soft clink of porcelain. Before we finish, she said with a smile, I have something small to share. A young cousin, Reese, seated down the table, bored with the conversation, pulled out his phone discreetly under the tablecloth. The soft glow illuminated his face. He began idly scrolling, half listening to the conversation, half distracted by his screen. Guests were settling in chairs with polite interest, sipping from their cups, expecting pleasant small talk. But from the screen in Reese's hand, it was clear this was no ordinary afternoon. Reese paused, his eyes fixed on the screen. He subtly shifted, leaning closer to the cousin beside him. He whispered something, urgently. The cousin's eyes widened. Another phone came out discreetly. The whispers spread like wildfire down one side of the table. Hushed, urgent, laced with disbelief. Wait, what did that say? Is that him? No way. Look him up. Oh my God. The buzz intensified, growing too loud to ignore, even over Arthur's attempts to start a new topic. Arthur trailed off, frowning. Sylvia looked down the table, startled by the sudden commotion. Reese looked up, his face pale under his tan, eyes darting towards Isaiah, who remained seated, calm, holding his coffee cup. Reese began, his voice barely a whisper, before clearing his throat and trying again, louder, filled with stunned awe. His Isaiah T. Vance. Silence fell over the entire table. Utter, complete silence, punctuated only by the faint clink of a spoon hitting porcelain as someone dropped it. Every eye was now fixed on Isaiah, but the gaze had changed entirely. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by shock, confusion, and a dawning, wide-eyed realization. Another cousin, looking equally stunned, added in a hushed tone, founder of Ascend Group Holdings? The one in Forbes? 8 figures, someone breathed. He backed those fintech startups last year. The air crackled with the sudden, brutal dismantling of every assumption they had made. The man they had subtly condescended to, whose job they thought sounded vague, who they joked might Uber, was a figure of significant wealth, power, and influence. The quiet, humble demeanor they had mistaken for smallness was, in fact, the quiet confidence of a man who owned the building while they were busy commenting on his loafers. Isaiah sat unmoved. No smugness, no grand smile, just that same calm gaze, watching the wind stir the trees outside as if he hadn't just flipped the entire room on its head. Clara took her seat again beside him. Her fingers found his under the table. She squeezed gently. "I didn't do that to show them off," she whispered. "I know," he said softly, "but I'm glad they saw." Across the table, Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The woman who'd commented on Isaiah's shoes earlier now stared at him like she'd never seen him before. The cousin who joked about Ubering looked like he wanted to disappear into the linen, but it was Clara's parents who held the most unreadable expressions. Her father leaned forward slightly, studying Isaiah. Not in the way someone studies a stranger, but in the way someone reconsiders everything they thought they knew. Her mother blinked, then lowered her eyes, her lips pursed in quiet reflection. No one spoke for a long moment. Then finally, Isaiah stood. "Thank you," he said to the room, "for welcoming me into this day and into your family. I know sometimes we see people and think we already know their story." He looked around, not accusing, not proud, just present. "But I've learned that the quietest people often have the longest chapters." He raised his coffee cup slightly, nodded once, and sat back down. No one dared say another word. The final glow of the evening faded into a soft lavender dusk outside, casting long shadows across the Fairweather estate. The lamps inside flickered to full brightness, and the buzz of conversation had mellowed into hushed reflection. The air no longer carried tension. It held something closer to reverence or guilt or both. But Isaiah hadn't changed. He stood near the serving table, sleeves rolled slightly at the forearms, quietly helping the waitstaff clear used plates and wipe down a few coffee-splashed linens. He didn't make a show of it, in fact, no one even asked. It was just Isaiah, steady, grounded, doing what needed to be done without fanfare. Someone from the catering team offered to take over, but Isaiah shook his head with a gentle smile. Almost done. Across the room, guests whispered to each other in more respectful tones now. There was no more second-guessing, no more sideways glances, no more smirks. The man they had dismissed with casual prejudice just hours ago had, without raising his voice or boasting a word, dismantled every assumption they'd made. And he had done it with grace. Clara sat off to the side with her mother, chatting softly. Her mother's posture had shifted, less rigid, more present. There was a tenderness in her gaze now, directed toward her daughter and toward Isaiah. But it was Clara's father who took the longest to move. He stood near the large fireplace at the edge of the drawing room, staring at Isaiah for a long while, as if weighing the pride he'd always worn against the humility he'd just witnessed. Finally, he walked over. Isaiah was setting down a stack of glassware when he heard the footsteps. "Isaiah," the older man said, clearing his throat. Isaiah turned slowly, polite as ever. "Yes, sir." Clara's father paused, his eyes usually firm and analytical, were softer now, tinged with something that looked like regret. "I owe you an apology," he said plainly. Isaiah didn't blink. He just gave a small, slow nod. "You never owed me anything but fairness." There was a beat of silence between them, filled with everything that had gone unsaid for days, weeks, maybe longer. Clara's father let out a breath, the kind a man exhales when he realizes how small his world used to be. "I didn't see you," he admitted. "Not really." Isaiah met his gaze and replied gently. A lot of people don't until they have to. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't sharp. It was just the truth. And in that moment, it hung heavier than any lecture ever could. They shook hands, not as a performance, not as a symbol, but as two men who now saw each other clearly. As the guests began to leave, Isaiah returned to Clara's side. She looked up at him with a warmth that made the room lights dim in comparison. "You didn't have to stay and help," she said softly. He shrugged with a smile. Didn't feel right to leave the mess behind. She took his hand. "You never do." They stood together near the doorway, surrounded by the quiet echoes of a gathering that had been so sure of its place in the world. Until one man's humility reminded them how small their vision had been. Isaiah hadn't needed wealth to prove his worth, but the wealth had forced them to confront their ignorance. And in the end, the lesson wasn't about the money. It was about the man.